For fellow computer geeks, there's nothing better during trying times than some good old-fashioned geek therapy building a new PC. I've been rocking my Intel 4790K since about 2015, and while it is still a fantastic CPU, my production workload can definitely benefit from more cores. Fortunately, thanks to the recent competition between Intel and AMD, going Team Red has never been better. Sit back, relax, and let's build my new PC around the shiny new 12-core, 24-thread AMD Ryzen 9 3900X. First, a disclaimer. The purpose of this video is to share some joy and have some fun. This is not an in-depth PC build guide, but that said, if you've never built a PC before, there is a tip or two as we go along here that may help you on your way. As of recording, getting my hands on a 3900X and 32 gigs of 3600 MHz DDR4 RAM was no problem. Amazon had them on my doorstep in less than 2 days. It would actually make more sense to measure the delivery time in hours. However, currently, motherboards are a separate issue. As of recording, AMD is in a bit of a hubbub over future chipset support of Zen 3 and 4000 series processors. There is a scare that B450 might not be as future-proof as once believed. AMD has since changed course and promised at least some support for Zen 3 on B450, but that's an entire dumpster fire I won't get into right now. The bottom line is that regardless of what becomes of the upgrade path on B450, 500 series chipsets are the path of least compatibility resistance, and X570s were hard to come by. But a few weeks later, I finally have my beautiful new X570 motherboard. This specific flavor being the MSI MPG X570 Gaming Plus motherboard. It was under $200, has all the features I need, and I trust MSI. Peeking around the motherboard, I like the general layout. I have worked with some real nightmare boards over the years, and this one is a breath of fresh air. Now, your mileage may vary as it all depends on your PC case and components, but I think most people would like this board. I particularly like the fan header layout. I like all of the headers layouts, actually. In fact, the motherboard swap went suspiciously smoothly. I barely had to reroute anything. Anyone who has built enough PCs can't help but feel suspicious and uneasy if things are going too perfectly. I'm not bleeding or cussing. Surely something isn't right. There isn't enough blood or begging God for mercy. But there were no major gremlins. The entire process was rather delightful. A very welcome change of pace, but I'm not getting used to it. Being careful is par for the course, but the CPU still dropped into the socket effortlessly, as did the stock Wraith cooler. Now, before you label me a pleb, the stock cooler is of course temporary. I'll swap in my Silverstone Heligon HEO2 once I receive the AM4 socket bracket hardware. By the time this video uploads, I'll be rocking the HEO2. Speaking of using parts I already own, it goes without saying that reusing parts you already own is a massive, massive money saver. I bought the HEO2 knowing full well it would serve active duty as I upgrade CPUs and platforms. Same with my PC case, the Corsair Carbide Series 330R Blackout Edition Ultra Silent. I'm also reusing my 0 RPM Silent Corsair RM750 power supply and have several Noctua fans available. All parts that I've accumulated over time, here and there. A quick note about power supplies and the CPU power connection. If your board has these extra 4 pins, they are entirely unnecessary unless you're doing extreme overclocking. Like I'm talking liquid nitrogen extreme competition overclocking. These extra pins are only to support extra juice under those rare extreme conditions. In other words, unless you plan on overclocking with liquid nitrogen to compete with Gamer's Nexus, don't freak out if your power supply only has an 8-pin CPU connector. 99.9% of overclockers won't even come close to what even 8 pins can provide. More effectively, your CPU can literally burn down your house before you even need to think about adding 4 more pins on your CPU. 8 pins can provide about 383 watts or thereabouts. That's still overkill headroom. Using only 4 pins provides about 185 watts. Still enough to run most CPUs, especially if you're not planning on overclocking. For those of you regular listeners to the Geek Therapy Radio podcast or the actual radio broadcast, I've mentioned the name of my outgoing 4790K build here and there. I called it Demon's Whisper. I wanted pure silence out of extreme power. You'll notice this single rad AIO cooler on the 4790K, that was temporary. I was tinkering with something. Needless to say, it's not going back into the Ryzen build. The 4790K is probably going into a tiny gaming HT-PC build, but that's neither here nor there right now. I'll need a new name for this silent Ryzen build, and right now I'm thinking of naming her Patientia, Latin for quiet strength. I'm also reusing the existing solid-state drives and hard disk storage drives. I know what you're thinking.
Spinning disk drives make more noise.
Well, yes they do, but I only use them for bulk storage. My OS, programs, and project data are entirely solid-state. One solid-state drive for software and others for project data and exports. That means the bulk storage hard disk drives only spin briefly on first boot and then hibernate motionlessly while I'm working on editing audio and video. The only time they spin up again is if I'm offloading files to them to free up solid-state storage. I also have Steam games I rarely play on one of the hard disk drives. The point is, when I'm working on anything critical that requires silence, I can hear Jack fart downstairs and the leaves rustling across my street. My PC is well below the noise floor of ambient environment, even with 1 or 2 Noctua case fans barely rotating. Even on your hands and knees, with your ear on the case, you can't hear anything. If the case didn't have a light on it, there's really no way to tell that it's actually on. I mean, unless you've got the computer monitor on and you're looking at the desktop. I'm okay if the fans spin up during a project export. In that scenario, I want all the power I can squeeze out of 12 glorious cores. I still have my 0 RPM Asus Strix NVIDIA GTX 980. The fans only spin during heavy gaming. Again, that's completely fine. They don't spin when mixing a podcast or music. That's the point. Now, I brain farted when I installed the RAM and put them into non-ideal slots. I changed them later into the proper slots, of course. When I first boot the system, the BIOS basically told me, hey, it's cool, but your RAM isn't in the best configuration. So I did a duh, and that was that. My copy of Windows 10 is still on a SATA M.2 SSD. I'll clone it to a PCIe 4.0 NVMe M.2 over the next few weeks, I'm sure. I'll note here that if you only have a SATA M.2 SSD, this board doesn't like putting it in the top M.2 slot. Put your SATA M.2 SSD into the lower slot and the PC boots just fine. The BIOS didn't see the SATA M.2 in the top slot. I'm guessing the top slot is PCIe NVMe only. I have a PCI Express Wi-Fi/Bluetooth module that basically finishes off this Ryzen upgrade. The system booted into Windows 10 seamlessly on the first try. It recognized every drive and every peripheral. I didn't have to do anything. I was naturally worried about first boot, but Windows automatically set up the new devices and installed all necessary new drivers. It took maybe 5 minutes, if that. When I got to the desktop, absolutely nothing changed other than the task manager showing the new motherboard, processor. You know, I'm not that old, but I was born in 1983. Let me just tell the iGen something right now. We are completely spoiled as of 2020. Building PCs or simply upgrading them used to be a complete and utter nightmare. So I mentioned that as far as booting into Windows is concerned, nothing changed other than the system showing a different CPU, motherboard, and RAM. Yeah, well, of course things changed. Let's look at just a handful of benchmarks pitting the outgoing 4-core, 8-thread 4790K at 4.3 GHz across all cores against the 12-core, 24-thread 3900X at stock settings on a stock cooler. The 3900X lets the GTX 980 stretch its legs a little more, but nothing earth-shattering. Still pleasant frame gains, though. especially in the R15 benchmark. Most games don't typically utilize all 12 cores, so gaming isn't the best test of a 12-core CPU. The gains are in multi-threaded productivity tasks, so the gains in Cinebench R15 and R20 are nothing short of jaw-dropping, at least for me coming from a 4790K. Rendering a test video project in Vegas 15 realized a 36% faster export time under identical export settings. 13 minutes and 1 second versus 17 minutes and 46 seconds. And the 3900X, and the GTX 980 for that matter, weren't even breaking a sweat. So that leads me to a couple notes here to keep in mind. First, the stock cooler is decent for a stock cooler, but the 3900X is a beast that needs better cooling. The stock cooler will get you by, but it gets hot. I saw 90 degrees Celsius hot, and it leaves a lot of performance overhead on the table as you'd expect reaching such temperatures. There are gains to be had stepping up to an aftermarket cooler, especially an absolute unit like the Heligon HE02. I have also not yet begun to see how much I can squeeze out of an overclock. Needless to say, when I slap that thick boy HE02 on here and tinker with some voltage and frequency settings, I'll comment below with the results. I don't think expecting a 4.3 GHz all-core overclock is unreasonable. I wouldn't be the first to achieve those numbers, but we'll see how well I fare in the silicon lottery. Another note before we wrap up here, the 3900X has a different die layout than, of course, a 4th gen Intel i7. The Intel i7 has its cores almost centered under the heat spreader, while the Ryzen 9 has the layout spread around a bit. Meaning, by all accounts, a dab of thermal paste front and center isn't the best route with a 3900X, and likely other Ryzen processors. So I spread it around evenly before attaching the heatsink. Now I'm sure there is debate about this. Securing the heatsink should spread paste out evenly itself, but helping distribution while applying won't hurt. Fight me. I'm not saying add more paste, I'm just saying spread the paste out. You know what else I'll say to get the peanut gallery really rabbling? You can reuse thermal paste as long as it's relatively fresh and free of dust and debris. Come at me. Joking aside, debates like these is what makes PC building fun. I'm sure there have been many a flame war over a dab of thermal paste versus a thin line of it. Whatever, as long as the temps are okay. I think that about sums it up. I hope you enjoyed watching me tinker with my new AMD build. Make sure to toss a like, put any comments below, and if you consider subscribing, I would really honestly appreciate it. Also, look for the Geek Therapy Radio podcast in your favorite podcast app. Just look for the red, white, and black color scheme and you'll be good to go. You can also find me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, where I'm usually tinkering with my 1983 DeLorean or other random neat things. Just search for Geek Therapy Radio on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and all that good stuff, or go to geektherapyradio.com for more info and Patreon support. But most of all, know that you are worthy of love, both giving and receiving love, and you are also worthy of your own self-respect. We are all geeks about something, so embrace your inner geek, and I'll see you next time.